Yeah. I want to examine the text in Vayetchanan, Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter. Moshe says this: Now, O Israel, listen to the decrees and the ordinances that I teach you to perform, so that you may live, and you will come and possess the land that Hashem, the God of your forefathers, gives you. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor shall you subtract from it, to observe the commandments of Hashem your God that I commanded you. Your eyes have seen what Hashem did at Baal Peor, and every man that followed Baal Peor, Hashem your God, destroyed him from your midst. But you who cling to Hashem your God, you are all alive today. Now skip down to verse 9. Only beware of yourself, greatly beware of your soul, lest you forget these things your eyes have beheld, lest you remove them from your heart all the days of your life, and make them known to your children and to your children's children. The day that you stood before Hashem your God at Horeb, when Hashem said to me, gather the people to me, and I shall let them hear my words, so they shall learn to fear me all the days of their lives on the earth, and they shall teach their children. This text today is a very important part of proof text in which we can know that Torah is divine. I want to look at three proofs that Torah has divine origins. I think that these 3 proofs have been the thing that helped me in my journey to where I'm at today. Because one of the things that all of us that have taken this arduous journey from Avodah Zarah to Judaism is to examine what is true, and what can we know that what is true is that which can be verified by historical fact. Today, you and I sit and study at the table of Torah study because of the preservation of Torah that has been taken very serious by the great Chachams of Torah Judaism for 3,700 years. There have been those who have went off the derrick. There were tribes that were left to themselves after being taken into captivity. However, there has been the nucleus of Judah, the Jewish people, that have preserved the Torah to its highest degree. Textual integrity, very important. So today, we are gleaning the fruit of their hard labor. We're gleaning the fruit of their actual willingness to preserve Torah even to the point of death. In this week's reading, Moshe pleads 2 things. He pleads 2 things to the Lord: to be permitted to enter into the land, and second, that the people do not forget what they have observed and they have seen. Although Moses does not mention, does not use the notion of the word lehit hanin, to plead, when he addresses the people, nevertheless, he repeats time and time again the demand to remember the events of the past, so that the tone of his words is one of emotional beseeching. This can be seen clearly in the text, and it says this, and we've read this, but take the utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously, so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you shall live, and make them known to your children and to your children's children. That's the verse 9 that we started to read. One of the things that helped me to begin to seriously examine whether Torah was divine in its divine source was when I heard Rabbi Tovia Singer state this one thing, that the Jewish people, all of the people heard and saw the voice of God, and saw the words of God, and saw the display of God's splendor and majesty at Mount Sinai. Moshe could not have come down from the mountain and said, hey, you saw these things, and clearly it didn't happen, because if that would have been the case, all the people, you think Korah would have had a rebellion 3 years later? I don't think so. It would have happened right then, because it would have said, you're crazy, Moshe. This didn't happen this way. we all saw and heard. Emphasis is achieved by repeating the root word over and over, this root word being shemor, with the empathetic very much or moed, over and over. The warning is twofold: not to forget what their eyes have seen and not to let it fade from their mind, and they are instructed to pass this message on even further to the next generation. We are standing here today because Judaism has continued over and over, like very much, overemphasizing the historicity of their origin, that God took them out of Egypt. What is Pesach every year but a retelling of that very event? Now, Baruch Hashem, one day after redemption comes, we will no longer reflect about Egypt and coming out, but we will start talking about the great redemption that took place of the nation because of the Jewish people coming out of Egypt, because the people have taken Torah so seriously, and because we, right before redemption, the people of the nations, have been able to take Torah and grab a hold of it. We've been able to take the seat of a Jew and ask them to take us to the mountain and to show us their God. Moses' request of the people at this historic moment is understandable. We talked about this yesterday. We said we can understand how Moses could be so emotional. He has gone through all of this turmoil and trouble, knowing that he's part of the 40 generation to not enter into the land. He sees his sister die, and then Aaron dies, and his heart is melting within him because he wants to be in the land. And so his plea is, don't go into the land and forget this. This wasn't anything more than a very deep, heartfelt, feeling that he's requesting that this generation can attest to the Exodus from Egypt. There are three important events in the life of the people which they draw strength from, and then we're going to examine it as proof to the fact that the Torah is divine. Only this generation can attest to the Exodus from Egypt, the revelation of the Lord at Mount Sinai, and the miraculous conquest that took place for the Promised Land. Attesting to the Exodus is possible at this point, for there still survive many people whose mind this experience has been deeply inscribed. Who is this people? It was those people who were what? 20 years and younger. Although many of those people who took part in the Exodus had perished in the wilderness before Moses began the great orations described in Deuteronomy, nevertheless, the decree only applied to 20-year-olds and up, which means that 60-year-olds and younger was able to be endued with the spirit of the event themselves from their parents who talked about it. Maybe when they were young children, they were able to experience that, and they have it further and reinforced to them over and over. Moses' demand to investigate the past was addressed specifically toward the people in Deuteronomy 4:32. Let's look at this verse, Deuteronomy 4:32. But you have but to inquire about bygone ages. What is he saying? Take time to think about what your parents have told you. Take time to reflect about the events of the past. He says, you have but to inquire about bygone ages that came before you. Ever since God created man on earth, from one end of heaven to the other, has anything as grand as this ever happened, or has it like ever been before? So we see in Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, he sort of sets as a testimony to say, has this happened in any other nation? Who has experienced anything like this? The people belonging to this generation would be the ones who attest to the theophany at Sinai and the Exodus from Egypt. Let's examine Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, verse 33 through 34. He says, as many people heard the voice of God speaking out of the fire as you have and survived. Think about it. Who else has heard the voice of God spoken out of the fire and actually survived? Or has any God ventured to go and take for himself a nation in the midst of another prodigious act by signs and portents, by war and by mighty hand and outstretched arm and awesome power, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? So what is Moses trying to say? Do you know of any people in history that this has ever happened? Now that we have the ability to look back over history and look at archaeology, is there any other culture that attests to this type of event? None. There isn't one single culture. There are many religions that purport to say, well, this single prophet or this single individual who was high spirituality, high level of spirituality, had some type of spiritual revelation and download, and they went and told others about it, and other people began to follow their teaching, etc., etc. But nowhere in the history of religion and a people, a nation, has anyone been able to say that God himself chose them as his people. In the 14th year after the Exodus, that same group now had enough fortune to share along with the young of the third thrilling experience. The first stage in the conquest of the land. Now, they were too young probably to remember Sinai, and most definitely felt the reinforced nature of their parents reminding them over and over. I'm thinking of my own children. My children are in their 26 to 31 or something like that. I don't know. And so, but what they love to do is, when my daughter came home for her last visit, she was digging in some drawers and found all these photos from when they were little children. And they love talking about, hey, do you remember when this happened? You remember we went to this park and we did this and that? And most of that far removed. But in our family dialogue, we get to express it. Can you imagine if you and I were standing in the desert at Sinai? How in the world could we ever forget this? Would that not be a constant dialogue amongst our children? Hey, Mom, hey, Pops, do you not remember when so-and-so happened? Of course. This is when God chose us. As I said, this first stage of the conquest of the land, the end of which was taken out of Egypt, the Lord said, and listen to this verse, he says, I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptian and to bring them out of the land to good and spacious land, a land that flows with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, Exodus 3:8. In conquering the Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan, their abilities as conquerors became acknowledged, therefore assuring them to continue conquer the promised land. So think about this. These people went from being slaves of Egypt, beaten, oppressed, having no ability to serve Hashem, to great conquerors in a very short period of time. That itself, can you imagine the mind of young people as they remembered their fathers and their mothers being enslaved in Egypt? And they remember the miraculous exit out of Egypt. They remember how the hand of Hashem came and brought 10 plagues and caused the Pharaoh to say, just leave. And when they left, they didn't just leave as paupers, they left as very wealthy people. And you would think, okay, that should be good enough to know. Now Hashem reminds them here that as you come out of the land, you became conquerors. So in this wandering, they went from a slave mentality to a conqueror mentality. Indeed, juxtaposed to the call that they had remembered the exodus out of Egypt and the theophany at Sinai, suddenly comes a surprising summation of the victories over Og and Sihon. In a single breath with this statement that this is the Torah and these are the laws that must be obeyed. Now, why does Moshe bring this up again when he just addressed it? This just actually happened, and now Moshe is adding this last event to this. He says in Deuteronomy 4:45 through 49, these words, Deuteronomy 4:44 through 49. These are the decrees and the laws and rules that Moshe addressed to the people of Israel after they had left Egypt, beyond the Jordan, in the valley of Bet Peor, and the land of King Sihon of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, whom Moses and the Israelites defeated after they had left Egypt. They had taken possession of his country and that of King Og of Bashan, and the two kings of the Amorites, which were at the east side of the Jordan as far as the sea of Arabat, and at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah. This summation appears superfluous, For Moses had already given this detail before, as I said in Deuteronomy 2nd chapter, verse 17, and the 3rd chapter, verse 27. However, according to the explanation he proposed, there is a close connection between these events and the demand to remember them and not to forget as a basis of observing all commandments. Now the question is this: is Moshe asking them to consider the miracles as proof? We're going to talk about this in just a moment. This threefold testimony is the untold importance. Insofar as each component, one can apply that Maimonides is saying of the theophany at Sinai, which is found in Hilchot Yesod Da'i HaTorah in 8:1, says this: the Israelites did not trust Moses because of the miracles that he performed. For one who believes only because of miracles has doubts in his mind. That perhaps one could achieve miracles by magic. One could actually say that could happen, because we know that Paro's magicians were able to achieve miracles by magic. So because of what they because of what they trust in him, because of the theophany at Mount Sinai, for their own eyes had seen and not others, and their ears had heard and not others. The fire, the thunder, the flames, and he went into the cloud, and the voice spoke to him, and we heard, Moshe, Moshe, go and tell them such and such. So in Deuteronomy 5:4, it says, face to face the Lord spoke to you. The people heard God speak to Moshe, which was an amazing thing. It wasn't as if God said, hold on, God's speaking to me. God told me this, and they'll go, how do we know that? There's a lot of people who says God spoke to them. But really, how can you attest to that? You can't attest to it, can you? In other words, the entire people seeing and hearing providence, incontrovertible evidence, and constitutes the foundation on which the faith of the people of Israel stand. Just like the demand to uphold the Lord's commandments in all generations to come, this is the stress by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in his initial presentation of the Jewish faith in the book called Kuzari. You remember this? You guys remember the book Kuzari? If you had not had a chance to read it, you need to read it. It's amazing. It says, when the king of the Khazars expressed surprise at the narrow nationalist presentation instead of a broad universalist declaration, after making an analogy to the king of India, the rabbi answered in Kuzari, the first chapter, verse 25, it says, in this way I answer thy question. In the same way God commenced his speech to the assembled people of Israel, and he says, quote, I am the God whom you worship, who has led you out of the land of Egypt. But he did not say, notice this, I am creator of the world, your creator. Now in the same style I spoke to thee, prince of the Khazars, when you did ask me about my creed. I answered 3, as was fitting and is fitting for the whole house of Israel. Who knew these things first from personal experience and afterward through uninterrupted tradition, which is equal to the former. In the course of history, documented in the Bible, we see how in their daily lives the people carried out each one of these decrees. Even to this day, when we have a discussion with someone who is not of the Jewish faith, say in another faith, who says, well, that's just made up stuff from the rabbis. You know, why would you, these are decrees given that make no sense at all. And how do we know that this was passed on from one person to the other? What's our response? Our response to them is they were given the responsibility of preserving the oracles of God. Who are we to contend with the ones that God chose to carry the Torah? See, that's my argument as to why I know it's divine, because God chose the people, and of all people of the world, he chose the ones that amongst all of their afflictions and their downtrodden and their difficulties and their sin and their backsliding, they continue to preserve the Torah to this day. We actually have books on our library shelf right now because somebody in a dark cave somewhere or in a dark room or in a dark attic with a candle meticulously scribed down the words and arguments of the sages of Judaism that go back thousands of years to the Sanhedrin. Goes back to the judges when Moshe selected the judges. You see, how can one who is not, even the Jewish community, there are people in the Jewish community who debate the, the authority of the Jewish text. There are people in the Jewish community that completely negate the oral Torah. The Karaites are an example. Completely negate it. But the point is this. If God chose them, now here's the kicker for me. This is what I would say. If God chose the Jewish people, or the Israelite people, to be the preserver of the Torah, and by the time the 10 tribes split, and the Benjamites and Yehuda were taken into captivity, and they come back, they settle the land, and the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud's written, by the time all of this began to happen, who actually attempted to preserve the Torah, both oral and written? The Jewish people, Judah, which was Benjamin and Judah. They've worked hard to preserve it. And they've worked hard to keep the integrity of the Torah in line. Who has the chutzpah to say God didn't know what he was doing? And if you have that kind of chutzpah, go start your own religion and be happy with what you believe in. But if you want to know the truth, if you want to know what the evidence is, it's in the fact that these three events solidified the divine nature of Torah. What people have been plucked out of slavery, been given a divine law of ethics and morality that bring connection to the Creator, and this Creator chooses this people, even with their imperfections and blemishes, to be the representation or the priest to the nations. And thirdly, they became a conqueror. How about let's add some more evidence? How about the fact that they were not a nation for how many years? Roughly 2,000 years. We're not a nation. And every nation thought that Israel was no longer going to come back. They just figured, and that's why Christians so easily assumed that they were the replacement for the Jewish people. I'm not sure if that tradition is in Islam, is it? I'm not sure. I don't know. In some aspects, Hezbollah does state that the reason why the Jews need to be kicked out of the land is because they are Russia, they're evil and wicked. And correct, the Pseudo-Syrians, correct, absolutely. So this idea that we have all of this proof that Torah is divine, and my question to my friends who might be listening to this video who are not Jewish, who might be entertaining the idea of the authenticity of the Torah, is what are you waiting on? What further proof do you need that if God chose them, no place in the Torah did he say he was going to replace them? No place. Did he? Could somebody inform me? Because if there was, I don't know where it's at that God said, I've now replaced you. I mean, look at this. Even in the events with Deborah and Barak, when they break out into song and burst in joy, having prevailed over their enemies, describe God's favor at Mount Sinai. You remember the great prophetess, Deborah? When they won in battle, they didn't sing about the praises of God over the battle. They sang about God's revelation of Torah. This is the example. Here is another one. That's also found in Judges 5, 4 through 5. Gideon contrasts the pathetic state of the nation in his time to the glory of the miracles that were wrought for the Israelites in the time of the Exodus in Egypt. So here Gideon, being beat down, where was he found by the angel? He wasn't in the threshing floor, was he? He was out in the woods somewhere because he didn't want to get caught. And it is even at that place in Judges 6:13 that he talks about the Exodus from Egypt. Even Jephthah counters the Amorite demand for return of territory on the other side of the Jordan River. Surprises us with the historical survey of the conquest of the region found in Judges 12, 5 through 26. Once again, the Jewish people, every time they're challenged, they say, this is our land, God gave it to us, here's the proof, here's the three proofs, Egypt, Sinai, conquest. To me, I think I would jump up and levitate if Bibi Netanyahu would get on TV and say, here is the proof that Israel belongs to us. And not only Israel, but the Transjordan. Can you imagine what would happen in all of the world? They would go bananas, because then he would recite Egypt, Sinai, conquest, this is ours, deal with it. But of course, I don't think he'll do it, because he is, and we say not in a negative way, a consummate politician. Even many of the Psalms reflect a vibrant historical memory in great detail, at the times of brief allusions of great value, because they do not intend to give a sympathetic historical review, as the following example. Here we go. You plucked up a vine from Egypt, you expelled the nations and planted it. Think of the imagery of that. He plucked the vine out of Egypt, took and cleared off the land and put them in the land of Israel. You cleared a place for it, it took deep root and filled the land. Well, can you imagine Benjamin Netanyahu getting up and quoting that psalm? Over the years, people will arise who will cast doubt on the story of the Exodus. I listened yesterday with my own ears on Israeli news television. A member of the Palestinian or Sudistinian organization who said, the interviewer says, well, what about the fact that the Temple Mount, the Jewish people have had their temple on that mount long before the mosque was ever put there? And he goes, that's a complete myth. She goes, well, it's not a myth. There's actually archaeology proof. No, I believe it's a myth. I believe it's a myth. But the whole point is, the only way that they can continue their scenario is to completely deny Israel's, authority and gift of the land. Legitimate claim. And let me tell you, the legitimate claim goes all the way back to Abraham. Abraham bought the land his wife was buried in. He bought, his son purchased land. So the whole point is this: there is more proof than a person. As a matter of fact, if a person would begin to study, and we're going to throw this challenge out to the people that watch, because none of you guys need this proof. I just want you to go out and look at the evidence, the sole producing evidence in archaeology, in history, and in the Torah, the Tanakh, that proves that God gave this land to the people and He has not taken it away from them, but that He will fully restore them to the land. You will have so much evidence, you will choke on it. You will have so much evidence, it will, as a matter of fact, God will destroy your religion. He will destroy your religious views when you realize that. And I take it to the court of those who are very secular Jews that are out there. They go, well, I don't know, I'm doing my own thing, you do your own thing, and everything's fine. But if you realize the power that the Creator of the universe has selected you for a mission in this world, you would get up and run to Torah. You would fully embrace it when you realize the joy that is going to be when redemption comes. And not only all the Jewish people, but the righteous of the nations will be able to inherit the land. That concludes this discussion of Shurim, and we'll go into our oral discussion. Thank you.